Welcome to Addictions and Dependencies, HE 104 at Queensborough Community College. My name is Stephen Whitlock. I'll be your instructor. We'll be using this textbook, Drugs Across the Spectrum, 8th edition. Hello everybody, this is your instructor Steve, and welcome to our first presentation of Addictions and Dependencies. This class is HE 104. It's a 3-credit course in the Health, Phys Ed, and Science department. Going over today. This course is really designed to give you a little bit of an expanded, not only knowledge, but insight in the topics of drugs and substance abuse and how it affects our society and how it affects the individual and families. And we're hoping to go a little bit beyond what you might have learned in high school health class as far as drugs being bad and don't do drugs and just say no, which of course, definitely not advocating drug use whatsoever, but I'd like to give you a little more information on how to make educated decisions on what you choose to do or how these issues tend to affect you and your family. As you know, this is an asynchronous class, meaning there is no set time that we'll be meeting. We will present new material every Monday at 9 o'clock, and you have a syllabus on your Blackboard panel, and it goes date by date of which material we'll be presenting. So to give you a little idea of what's going to be required of you, every week there's going to be assigned reading, assignments, and test material. There's a textbook that goes hand in hand with this course. It's called Drugs Across the Spectrum, 8th edition. I've probably sent that information in an email previously. But every week, you're going to be required to do a couple of things. There will be some assigned discussion questions in which I would like you to answer to the best of your ability. There's going to be homework assignments, and there's going to be quizzes. And at the end of the course, there's going to be a final examination, which will not be difficult by any means, but requires a little bit of attention to this class. So how does your final grade overall break down? Well, your homework accounts for 20%, 20% of your grade. As we mentioned before, the homeworks are assigned previously to the covered material. They consist of about anywhere from 10 to 20 multiple choice questions, in which you have 2 attempts to complete. My recommendation is for you to read the assigned material prior to your first attempt. Try to take the homework / quiz assignment. Once it's finished and submitted, go over the answers, go over the little training material and teaching material that's included with each answer, and then you'll have a second attempt to take this assignment again. And once all is said and done, and once both attempts have been submitted, the higher of the 2 attempts will be entered into your overall grade. So it's really not much of a quiz, it's more of a learning exercise to kind of get you engaged in the material before the presentations. The discussion questions are really the big bulk of your grade. As you can see, it makes up about 50% of your grade, and the purpose of the discussion questions is to have you think about topics in this field and give a little bit of insight and some critical thinking as to what this topic is about. Most discussion questions will require about a 150 to 200 word response. The discussion questions will be based on how, not necessarily how accurate your answer is based on knowledge recall, but on how well constructed your answer is. What kind of thought, how is it put together, how you make your argument, whether you're pro or for something that we talk about. We'll discuss that a little bit more. Quizzes make up about 10%. Quizzes will be covering everything that was previously covered. So for today, we'll be talking about Chapter 1, Introduction to Drugs Across the Spectrum, and the assigned quiz that you'll have a week to complete will cover the material that we've talked about. It will be very, very basic questions, usually either multiple choice or true or false format. You have one attempt to complete the quiz. It is timed, whereas the homework assignments, you really have no time limit to complete the quizzes you do. Anywhere from 10 to 20 to 25 minutes, depending on the length of the quiz. And you have one shot to take them. And then the final exam we'll talk about when we get closer to the end of the semester. I understand the challenges and the difficulties and the headaches of trying to complete a course completely online. It's not fun. I truly would rather be in the classroom with everybody, interacting and making it more of a workshop type deal rather than just a bland lecture. And I know technical issues can be a problem. Assignments are expected to be submitted on the date indicated on the syllabus. However, I do offer a little bit of flexibility. So, for example, I will drop the lowest homework grade, I will drop the lowest quiz grade, and I will drop the lowest discussion question. So if you wind up somehow, some way missing a deadline on an assignment or a quiz, or if your computer breaks down, or some other situation occurs, well, that's the flexibility you're allotted. And once that happens, it's really up to you to figure out what went wrong and make amends for that. And the final examination should be self-explanatory. So it's highly recommended that all timed quizzes and final examinations be performed on a dedicated wired computer. Don't want your wireless signal crashing to be an excuse for poor performance. We do work on the Blackboard electronic learning system, and it's recommended that you use the latest version of Google Chrome or Mozilla Firefox. I definitely recommend not taking the quizzes or the homeworks, and definitely not the final, on any type of smartphone device. Those situations are notorious for crashing and causing bad outcome in performance. So moving on, this is your grading rubric for your discussion questions, and we'll go over that a little bit later on. You get a grade of anywhere from 0 to 4 on your response to the questions we present at the end of this presentation. So you'll get 4 points for a provocative response that goes beyond simply answering the prompt. Attempts to stimulate further thought and discussion questions. Response is grammatically intact with little to no errors. Facts and sources properly cited. Now, I don't expect doctorate level work on these responses by any means. I know the struggles we're all going through. I know this is not the easiest thing in the world. But again, for example, if I give you a question such as, should drugs be legalized? I expect more than just a yes-no answer. I expect you, if you are in favor of that, and by the way, the questions won't be that simplistic, but if you're in favor of the question, then please tell me why. Please name some sources to say why it would be a good idea to legalize drugs, and cite those sources. And again, I'm not expecting APA format citation criteria, but just something to show me that you used somebody else's material, that you looked up the material, and you're giving that person credit for it. A substantial response provides most of the content required by the prompt, but does not require further analysis of the subject. Minimal to moderate grammatical errors, facts and sources properly cited. A superficial response provides obvious information without further analysis of the concept, lacks depth of knowledge or reasoning, multiple grammatical or spelling errors. It shows me something that you really didn't put any care or effort into, and that's going to give you a minimal grade. A 1 really is the least amount of effort that can be put into these discussion questions, and a 0 is nothing's been submitted at all. Now, I'll tend to be a little bit liberal on the grading within the first few weeks of the session, but as we move on later on into this course, I expect better effort and better material from these discussion questions. These discussion questions are really what this course is all about. It's not a course where I can just throw a bunch of material at you and have you repeat it back on a standardized exam and then forget about. That's the most basic level of education. What I'm looking for us to accomplish here is to kind of develop your way of thinking, your insight, and your ability to think critically based on the material that we're going to be presenting over the next, 14 weeks. So let's start. Chapter 1, Drugs in Perspective. So we know that drugs play a very pervasive part in our society. What are some of the objectives of this class? Well, you can read this in your textbook as well, but describe how drug use, misuse, and abuse differ. Characterize protective and risk factors. Compare and contrast environmental and biological risk and protective factors. Explain the reason why people take drugs. Analyze the influence of drug use. Know the difference between drug dependency and drug addiction. A lot of times we use those terms interchangeably and we don't really understand what the difference is. So just pause for a second and tell me, how would you define a drug? Now, depending on your reference, there are many different ways a drug can be defined. If you're talking about medicine, you're talking about a drug is any substance that, when given in sufficient amount of quantities, can exert a physiological influence on the body. Simple as that. If you're talking about a drug in the terms of substance abuse, which is a little more what we're geared towards, we talk about things that are mind-altering, behavioral altering, and we differentiate between licit and illicit drugs. So in medicine, we use the term pharmacology. It's a science that deals with drugs. Now, drug here is defined as a substance that is used for prevention, diagnosis, treatment, and cure of the disease in animals and humans. That's the medical definition of it. But for our purposes, drug is any substance that alters one's ability to function emotionally, physically, intellectually, financially, or socially. And basically, that refers to drugs of abuse, or not necessarily misuse. Alcohol, tobacco, narcotics, stimulants such as cocaine, methamphetamine. We're going to be talking about all of those within the coming semester. So what are the different types of drugs? Well, you can categorize them many different ways, but for the sake of simplicity, we'll break them down into 4 major categories. And you don't have to commit all the subdivisions here to memory. But first are your stimulants. These are the things that give a rush, give a high, accelerate the body's response and awareness to things, accelerate the body's metabolism. Very common examples would be things like caffeine, cocaine, methamphetamine, Ritalin, and some other things as well. Hallucinogens are things that bring about abnormal perceptions, not based in reality. Things such as hallucinations, whether it be visual or auditory. LSD would be the most common example of this category of drug, but there are others as well. Cannabinoids basically have their roots in the marijuana plants. There's natural cannabinoids, and then there are newer synthetic cannabinoids, and they have a whole host of properties. And then you have your depressants as well, things that kind of lower the body's metabolism, lower the body's rate of functioning, and have a whole host of side effects and issues as well as those, such as the opioids, tranquilizers, alcohol. Actually, alcohol has properties of a few of these things, but we'll talk more about that in detail as we move along. So, a couple of basic definitions to understand. Illicit drugs are drugs that are illegal, that have been designated by the government to be out of bounds, to be to actually need either a prescription to be dispensed or have been outright banned altogether. Drug misuse refers to the unintentional or inappropriate use of prescribed or over-the-counter drugs. Now, many different situations can occur with that. Could be discontinuing prescribed medicines. I see that a lot in my field when people are given antibiotics for a certain thing. They're given an antibiotic for an ear infection for 10 days. They feel better after 6 and they stop taking the antibiotic. Just because they feel better doesn't necessarily mean that the infection has gone away. And unfortunately, discontinuing that antibiotic can set them up for a rebound infection that's even worse later on. Consuming more of a drug than prescribed. So that whole notion that if a little is good, a lot's got to be better. Remember, the only thing that really differentiates a drug or medication from a poison is dosage. I'll give you an example I had some months ago, working in urgent care. I had a elderly 72, 73-year-old female come into my office complaining of jaw pain and severe jaw pain. And the first thing I'm thinking about as I'm going in to see her is, this poor woman having a heart attack, because that can actually be a presentation of a heart attack. But the interesting thing is she looked very ill. She was deathly ill. She was sweaty. She was pale. As I'm examining her, she told me she had this horrible toothache, and she's just been taking doses and doses of Advils. She's been taking 2 to 3 Advils every 2 to 3 hours to get this pain under control. Well, no sooner did she say that than she started vomiting up chunks of bright red blood all over our office. Her blood pressure had tanked. Her mental status started crashing. We almost lost her. We had to call 911, ship her out immediately. The overuse of all that pain reliever, that Advil, which we'll talk about its effects later on, caused severe bleeding in her stomach that almost nearly killed her. Saving or using old medications. And again, we see that a lot with antibiotics, but we also see that with other medications as well. We go, after 7 days out of 10, I felt better. Let me save these antibiotics for a rainy day. We're not following the directions for a drug. If something's supposed to be taken every 6 hours, it's going to lose its efficacy if it's taken every 12 hours. And a lot of times, one of the biggest individuals who are victims of substance misuse are your elderly. And maybe we can pause and think about a reason why that occurs. Well, for one thing, elderly people tend to be on a lot more medications than younger people. They could have medications that are prescribed by different providers, an orthopedic for one reason, a cardiologist for another reason, a rheumatologist for another reason, and quite often these practitioners do not have direct communication with each other, so that can be a problem. Just a problem of following labels directly and confusing very, very similar appearing drugs can also be a problem in the elderly population. So please don't confuse the term drug misuse with the term drug abuse. Drug abuse is the intentional and inappropriate use of a drug resulting in physical, emotional, financial, or intellectual social consequences for the user. So most substances that are involved in drug abuse are rooted in the fact that they give some type of physical reward. And that's a very important concept to remember. At least an initial physical reward, usually rooted in the feelings of pleasure or euphoria, and at least initially. And that's a common theme in every substance of abuse, whether it be alcohol, tobacco, Valium, cocaine, heroin. All illicit substances that are subject to abuse all initially hit the brain's reward centers, which we'll talk about later, which makes the body want to use them again and again and again. However, when we talk about the pharmacological and physiological aspects of drugs, we'll talk about how it doesn't work indefinitely. So factors play a role in whether an individual is more or less likely to use and abuse a drug. Protective factors reduce a person's risk for drug. Risk factors increase a person's risk for drug use. Well, obviously on that slide, you can't work with a partner unless you are partnering up with somebody on your own time. But if you could take a moment and think of what life situations could make more one prone to substance abuse versus less prone to substance abuse. We have a list here. So risk factors include lack of parental supervision, poor social skills, availability of drugs at school, community poverty. Parental abuse of drugs is a big one. It's a very high concordance of parental drug abuse and offspring drug abuse. Protective factors include parental monitoring and support, positive relationships and interactions. School anti-drug policies have been shown to have a positive effect in minimizing the amount of substance abuse that occurs in a community. Neighborhood pride, and that usually stems from activities in the school system itself. And parents that are on top and not necessarily preaching, but also practicing what they preach as far as non-use of drugs. Think about it. Why do you think people use drugs? Do you think it's because they are of low moral character? Do you think it's because of what we call addictive personalities? Do you think there are other reasons involved? I'd like to know some of what you guys may think on your own. Let's look at this. People are curious about drugs experimentation. Okay, the human species is a very curious species. I mean, think about it. Who was the first one to ever discover that you could eat raw oysters? Who was the first person that ever looked at a big wad of snot in a shell and said, that looks appetizing? Somehow, some way, as we've developed from the days of the caveman, we've learned things through trial and error, and it still continues today. How do little children learn about the world? They put things in their mouths and they experiment. They want to find some type of cause and effect. Some drug awareness programs arouse interest and curiosity, sometimes just overstimulating somebody as far as information, giving information overload. I was like, well, maybe is this really as bad as it seems? I don't know, putting so much attention into it. Something got to be going on. Media depictions of celebrities and well-known athletes using drugs may arouse curiosity. Can you think of some media celebrities? You think of some, like maybe Robert Downey Jr., Darryl Strawberry, just to name a few off the top of my head. And some adolescents use drugs due to poor impulse control. And that's really the underlying attribute of adolescence and pre-adolescence is poor impulse control. The area of the brain that controls rewarding behavior is more dominant during adolescence. We want that drive. We want that reward system. This is the body's way, the brain's way, of developing patterns that are going to be with them for the rest of their life. Area of the brain that controls the inhibitory response is less dominant. That's why teenagers get into so much trouble more than adults. And that's because they don't really know, but because they know, but they don't know that they know, if that makes sense. Pleasure, escape from boredom. People like the feeling they get from drug use. Do you think of a situation where drug use as a result of escape from boredom might be more prevalent than ever? Yeah, you got it. Probably this whole COVID-19 thing going on for the last year. People are shacked up in their houses, they're constrained, they're restricted. Alcohol use sales are at an all-time high. Inpatient detox centers are filled to the brim. And there's definitely a correlation as far as what's going on in the world today and increased substance use out in the field. And physiologically, the underdeveloped adolescent brain receives more pleasure from alcohol than compared to the adult brain. So enjoy it while you can, because when you get old and cynical, you have to pay more to get as much pleasure from the alcohol that you did back in the past. That was a joke, by the way. Positive reinforcement, reporting a positive behavior. So when you think about it, we're not saying that abusing drugs is a positive thing, but in the primitive areas of the brains, the pleasure that's initially derived from whether it be alcohol, nicotine, heroin, cocaine, incites what's considered a reward response. Human behavior is developed on what it sees as rewarding to enhance that behavior, or what is negative to prohibit behavior. We don't keep putting our hands on a hot stove because that negative enforcement of pain tells us, hey, hot stove, pain, stop doing that. We reproduce sexually as a species because we know the pleasure derived from orgasm stimulates the behavior of wanting to procreate sexually and keep the species going. It's just a very biological thing. Yeah, peer influence. I'm sure you were told about that several times in grade school and high school, and studies have shown that there's definitely a higher influence of substance issues when peers are involved. Take fraternities, for example. High incidence of alcohol use in fraternities and sororities as opposed to college individuals who are not affiliated with these type of organizations. Peer pressure is definitely a strong influence on drug use. During adolescence, the greatest influence in their lives are not really from parents' influence, but more so from the peers. At least in this country. And various countries and various cultures differ, but in this country and some other countries in Europe, most of adolescent behavior is developed by rebellion against authority. Adolescents attribute marijuana and alcohol use with increased popularity, and some of that can be enhanced from what they see in the media. We've already talked about what sororities and fraternities contribute to the pot. Some people use drugs for spiritual purposes as well. I mean, I grew up in the Catholic religion. I was an altar boy in my younger days. And yeah, part of each and every Catholic mass ceremony was the distribution of wine, which was considered to be the blood of Christ. And yes, I will admit that when we were finished with the mass and the priests weren't looking, we'd go dipping into that refrigerator and take a sip of that sacramental wine. I'm sure they were onto it at some point or another, but other religions, Native Americans used hallucinogenic drugs such as ayahuasca for centuries. The Rastafarian religion is highly based in marijuana use for spiritual purposes. And you can see, I'm sure you can see different examples throughout the world. Does that make it wrong? Does that make it right? Say. Drugs sometimes used to help facilitate social interaction. Well, think about it. Okay, we drink when we're happy. We drink when we're sad. We drink to celebrate new life. We drink after funerals. We drink at weddings. After our divorces are finished, we go out and have a drink. Alcohol is very prominent in our society for all sorts of social gatherings. And of course, sometimes people take drugs because they're told not to. Please don't email me and ask me what this is a picture of, because then you make me feel really old. A strong relationship is found between drug use and recklessness and pre-delinquent behavior. Now, it's a matter of what came first, the chicken or the egg. Is someone with a reckless and pre-delinquent and delinquent behavior more prone to substance abuse, or does the use of substances like alcohol, nicotine, and illicit drugs contribute to that behavior? Studies are still kind of out there. Adolescents who demonstrate oppositional behavior, and it's an actual medical diagnosis, it's called oppositional defiant syndrome, are more likely to engage in drug use. And again, is that more of a chemical, biological thing on their brains? Or is it something just because of their living, their social circumstance? It's kind of hard to tell. So as you can see, there's many different influences, many factors that contribute to the influences of drug abuse. No one real factor can speak for all. Let's talk a little bit about the terms drug dependency versus drug addiction. This course is called Addictions and Dependencies, And a lot of times we use those terms interchangeably, but there is somewhat of a difference. Drug dependency refers to the body adjusts to the presence of a substance and will exhibit withdrawal symptoms if the drug is discontinued. So when you're talking about dependency, you're talking about whatever substance it is becoming physically and chemically incorporated into the body's own biochemistry. Whereas drug addiction is a complex disease that impacts the brain, and it deals more with behavior. Drug addiction changes the brain's functioning and physical structure, which may be long-lasting. Let me give you a little bit of example of dependency and addiction with my own issues. So when I used to work out in the Bronx and living on Long Island, the ER I would have to be in at 7 o'clock a.m. If I would leave my house at 5:45, I could get from Long Island, I could get to the southern state, I could go down the Wantagh and over the bridge and through the Cross Bronx Expressway within enough time to usually be in the ER at least about a good 10 minutes early and get myself settled and ready for the day. Before jumping on that highway, about a block before getting on that highway, was my favorite 7-Eleven, which served my favorite coffee, Brazilian Bold. All right, so that was my normal morning routine. Get up in the morning, leave the house at 5:45, stop at 7-Eleven, get my 12-ounce cup of coffee, and then make my way down the highway for that hour or so long commute. Now, what happened if the alarm clock didn't go off, dog had an accident on the floor, or something kept me from getting out of the house on time? Well, you know that if I leave 10 minutes late and if I get on the highway 10 minutes late, I don't have that 10 minutes leeway by the time I get to the Bronx. If I'm 10 minutes late getting onto that highway, an hour later, I'm going to be a half hour late. That's the way traffic works. So knowing that, do you think that's going to really stop me from going to that 7-Eleven and getting that coffee, regardless if I know it's going to make me late or not? No, that's my addiction. So addiction refers to the behavior that's exhibited to obtain a particular substance despite any known negative consequences that might occur. And the negative consequences that occur would be me being late, me having my staff pissed off at me because they were short-handed, but that's me. Gotta have my coffee. That's an addiction. Whereas dependency is a little bit different. If by chance I did not grab that cup of coffee and I try to make my way out to the ER, I'd probably get there on time, but I would find myself physically being very miserable. Might have a little bit of a headache, might not be able to focus, might be a little distracted. That's because the caffeine in that coffee has been incorporated into my body to the point where I actually need it to physically function. That is a dependency. So that's pretty much the difference between the two. And we won't even talk about tolerance and withdrawal. But can you think of a situation where you may be dependent, not addicted, or vice versa? What about a situation where maybe drug may be addicted but not dependent? Just take that into consideration as you're mulling through what we're going over. This is an interesting question. Is addiction a choice? Now, I don't expect any yes or no answer from that. The question is obviously rhetorical, but I'd like you to think about that because that may be one of our discussion questions on the board at some point. Now, there are many theories as to why drug addiction occurs. No one is absolutely right. No one is absolutely wrong. What does it say here? The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services states that addiction is a chronic, life-threatening condition that has its roots in genetic susceptibility, roots, not cause, social circumstances, and personal behavior. So what does that say? It's saying there's a lot of different factors that goes into drug addiction. Theories for drug addiction include personality, reinforcement, biological, and so on. So personality theory. So I'm sure everybody here has probably heard the term, well, this person so-and-so has had an addictive personality. Well, addictive personality, we use that term a lot. And personality refers to the dynamic set of traits acquired by a person that influence his or her perception, motivations, behaviors, various occasions. Specific personality traits have been identified to drug dependence, but there really has never been any type of diagnosis or medical or psychological condition labeled as addictive personality. It doesn't exist. It doesn't exist in the medical literature. It exists in familial literature. But some traits that have been identified have been things such as low self-esteem, not having much self-confidence in oneself, poor interpersonal skills, someone who either can't get along with people, doesn't reach out and form social bonds, or someone who is a little more aggressive in those social bonds and doesn't conform to social norms. Need for immediate gratification, and some of that stems maybe from some biological issues, such as can be compared to the diabetic that needs insulin because they don't have insulin. We'll talk more about that during pharmacology. And another issue may be learned helplessness. So a person's social structure to the point where they're never really encouraged to be successful. They're always beaten down psychologically. And the only means of mentally coping with these issues is through the use of some type of immediate gratification, such as cocaine, heroin, alcohol, nicotine. It's difficult to determine whether the personality traits existed before their drug use or if drug use changes personality traits. Again, chicken or the egg. Reinforcement theory. Reward circuits in the brain get activated during drug use. And this is a pretty well-known situation about at least some of the motivations for drug use. The reward system in the brain of an addicted person may not be functioning properly. So what is a reward system? Well, the reward system in the brain helps enhance positive behavior. So that feeling of fullness and satisfaction after eating a good meal is going to signal the brain to try to repeat whatever behavior got to that point to get that good meal again. It's a survival mechanism. Again, I'll talk about why we reproduce sexually. Why don't we just bud off little stems and reclone ourselves? Well, first of all, yeah, it wouldn't be as much fun, but think about why we reproduce sexually. When two organisms mix and match their DNA and their genes, they create a whole separate offspring, half of which is from the father parent, half of which is from the mother parent, and a whole new set of offspring with different combinations of genes to function in its environment. If everybody just cloned a piece of themselves and reproduced the same exact mechanism, that might work efficiently, but if you change a person's environment, you change that community's living conditions, the whole species could be wiped out. Sexual reproduction helps the species, the human species, and every other species survive through environmental changes and even extinction level events. Now, do we know that as cave people, as Neanderthals and Cro-Magnons, that we needed to do that in order to keep our species surviving thousands of years into the future? No. We just knew that we reproduced sexually because it felt good. It's because the reward system in our brain perceived that pleasure, and it reinforced behavior to try to seek out that pleasurable activity again for survival of the individual. Drugs of abuse, which is cocaine, heroin, and so on, tend to mimic and take over and even hijack that mechanism. We'll explain that a little bit later on in the course. Reinforcers are stimuli that increase the likeliness of a particular behavior. So, for example, you probably heard that somebody's trying to quit smoking, and then they go out to a bar for a drink. That bar, which is previously associated with smoking or doing other type of activities, are more likely to take up smoking again because of these primary reinforcers. Then there's biological theory. Genetic theory. A person is predisposed to addiction by hereditary influence. And addiction is linked to reduced D2 dopamine receptors in the brain. There are studies to highly suggest that. A lot of studies were done in biological twins. It was found that twins who were separated at birth, raised in different families, regardless of the adoptive family's history of substance use, if the twins' biological parents had a predisposition to, then both twins, even in different living situations, had a higher incidence of substance abuse than would people in other environments. So, does it actually prove a genetic concordance? No, but it does show a correlation. Addiction to narcotics is sometimes attributed to a metabolic disorder. Narcotics can help addicts stabilize the metabolic deficiency caused by the absence of the drug. So it is the theory that some people who lack certain chemicals in the brain try to unconsciously or subconsciously self-medicate by obtaining, whether it be narcotics, alcohol, or even other type of behaviors, such as gambling, indiscriminate sexual practices. And again, think of all the social situations where substance use, we'll say mostly for alcohol at this point, is encouraged. Tailgate parties, New Year's Eve celebrations. Look at these social background and economic background of a country like Ireland, whose whole economic backbone is based on the tavern industry. These alone are several factors in the prevalence of substance abuse. Now, I'm not going to hold you too much on statistics. I find statistics relatively boring and easily referenceable, but just to go over, it's difficult to determine the impact of media on drug use. In 2012, Surgeon General stated that exposure to cigarette use in movies and television may cause young people to start smoking. As a result, cigarette use in movies and television declined significantly. So if I can present that from a personal point of view, I was a young child. There were certain movies that came out, such as Animal House, such as, for one, Blues Brothers, another. A lot of movies that came out in the late 70s and early 80s had a very, very, that's what I'm looking for, lighthearted view on substance abuse and drug abuse. Fast Times at Ridgemont High is another one. A lot of these teenage comedies from the early 80s. And then you had shows like Saturday Night Live that openly promoted the use of certain substances and made a lot of the comedic material out of it based on drug use. Then you had this public health push in the mid-'80s by the Reagan administration to just say no. And then there was kind of a turn in the paradigm. If you look at a lot of movies in the 80s, a lot of the movies in the later 80s had a very negative drug abuse connotation. They were very against drug use. So how that affects the general population has been very hard to determine. So with that, I'd like you to go over Chapter 1, and I want you to think of this discussion question for next week. So the state of Oregon recently decriminalized possession of small amounts of illicit drugs. Most offenses have been converted to low-level misdemeanors with no jail time. Is this a good idea? Explain and defend your response. That is going to be your assignment, one of your discussion questions assignments for next week. Next week, we'll be talking about mostly the legal aspects of substance use. The historical laws that have been enacted over the years, what contributed to these laws, what were the effects of these laws, how substance abuse and the law are affected today. And with that, if you have any questions about anything we've covered, please do not hesitate to post it on the discussion board, or you can email me personally as well. And have a good week, and we will pick this up next Monday.